Oh, we almost lost Dr. Tomco. All right, you guys, you got it figured out? You come this way if you need to. Okay. We're not going to lose anyone. All right. All right. So I'm Laura Eldred. I work for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. And so we're going to transition here into our next section, which is a panel discussion to delve a little bit deeper into this topic, the 6PPD and its effects on the environment. So just by show of hands from the audience, how many of you traveled to the symposium today in a vehicle that used tires? And if you didn't, then how many of you saw a vehicle with tires? All right, so this session is going to be of interest to all of us, right? So, okay, so we have, we're going to look a little bit at the status of the current science, some of the research needs, some of the on-the-ground work being done locally and nationally, and what might be happening in the near future. So some of this has already been addressed, but we are bringing in some other viewpoints and angles with some different agencies here. So let's meet our panel members. So of course we have Dr. Jenifer McIntyre with Washington State University. And then we have Matt LaCroix with the Environmental Protection Agency. We have Terri Lomax with the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. We have Strawn with the Matanuska-Susitna Borough. And then of course, Dr. Patrick Tomco with University of Alaska, Anchorage, right? Okay. All right, so we have a few prepared questions that we'll go through, and each of the panel members will address that. And then at the end, there's going to be plenty of time for additional questions from the audience, okay? So, panel members, what is your organization currently working on with the topic of 6PPD? So let's just start at one end and work our way down, okay? So what is your organization currently working on with the topic of 6PPD?
I think you saw what I'm working on. Okay. So I'll just pass my time.
Yeah, you're very busy. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So EPA, I would say, and others may disagree, but I'm going to talk the party line. EPA is fairly heavily invested in researching and looking at 6PPD and 6PPD-quinone. We have multiple programs, multiple offices that are involved. Our staff from our Office of Research and Development are participating and supporting the research that we had presentations about so far. Our NPDES permitting staff, National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System staff are looking at 6PPD-quinone as an emerging pollutant when they're issuing permits, which include MS4 permits for municipalities. So they're taking that into consideration. We have a watershed program that looks at TMDLs for impaired water bodies, also non-point source pollution, and trying to address that. We fund and support and encourage green infrastructure efforts. So that's all within our watershed program. There's a new Puget Sound geographic program that was recently established by Congress that is heavily involved in the Puget Sound area. There's a strategic stormwater initiative for Puget Sound. So we have staff that are looking at that. All of those efforts are based out of Seattle, the regional office for Region 10 for EPA. We don't have staff in the Anchorage office, which is where I work, that are focused on this issue. But just because folks are based in Washington doesn't mean they're not interested in Alaska. And as I think many of you know, I've recently been working with the Borough on the Water Body Setback Advisory Board, and that board has looked at this, examined this question, and tried to address whether or not there's relevance for stormwater in terms of water body setbacks. But so I'll leave it there. So we're supporting research. We have funding for that. We're collaborating with other agencies and with tribes. And So I'll pass it, not to take too much time, but not me personally, but the agency heavily involved in this work.
Good morning. So Terri Lomax with the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. So DEC has definitely been paying attention, watching this issue. We really appreciate all the work that's coming out of Washington and also here at UAA. So we're monitoring it very closely. We hold an informal working group just where we try to share information and knowledge that we've learned either through some work groups that are led by EPA or just paying attention to different research articles that come out. So we have that meeting, every 6 months, once a year or so, just to kind of bring everyone together on the latest science. We are also working with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game right now and Alaska DOT to put together a proposal for kind of our initial look into potential 6PPD hotspots in Anchorage. So this would not involve actual monitoring. Instead, it would be a GIS analysis of where we might see potential effects so that we can then direct funding and resources to immediate action rather than monitoring. We just can kind of assume that it's here. We have tires, we have fish, we have roads. But luckily, through all the terrific work that's been done in Washington, we also know there are some really great treatment options out there. So we are kind of moving in that direction, just looking at places where it actually might be a concern in Alaska and especially in Anchorage right now and moving in that direction. We also are funding green infrastructure. We have a couple of different green infrastructure grant sources that I'm sure I will be happy to talk about later on, where, you can go direct towards implementation as well. So we have a couple of different sources as that.
Thank you. So my name is Alex Strawn. I'm the planning director for the Matanuska-Susitna Borough. We are not doing things specifically for this chemical compound, but what we do is land use regulation and stormwater management. So as Matt said, we just had 18 meetings of a water body setback advisory board where we developed some pretty extensive regulations really geared towards regulating development along water bodies to ensure that there's a minimal amount of runoff that actually goes into the water bodies adjacent to the development. So that's in draft format and it's available for review. And we're sort of I'm going around to all the different community councils and explaining what it's all about and gathering input. We also, with 2020 census, thought that we were going to be having to apply for an MS4. We still don't know quite whether we're going to have to or not, but we are taking measures to whether we have to do an MS4 permit or whether we're going to have to in 2030. We are working towards compliance with MS4 permitting. Specifically, we have applied for an aqua grant to do outreach for some of our impaired water bodies. We've applied for a grant with the USGS to get LIDAR throughout the borough that we can then analyze to map all of our drainage ditches and outfalls and basically do a watershed mapping project where we can know where drainage is going. And then the idea being that we could hopefully, as we do road projects and subdivision developments and different types of projects, we can keep that information current. And then our Public Works Department is also working on what we're calling a design criteria manual that will apply within borough rights of ways. Any sort of borough project any borough road project or whatever will have specific criteria for managing the runoff associated with that.
You guys heard me talk for a few minutes, so I don't need any more time.
Excellent. All right. Well, that was very thorough. So that took care of all my questions. No. All right. So here's another by show of hands. How many in the audience think that stormwater is treated before it's discharged into our local waterways? Oh, very good, guys. Yeah. So most of our stormwater runoff is a direct discharge into some type of waterways. Now, we have been installing some treatment, some of that green stormwater infrastructure that was addressed. So I'm just going to put a plug out there that we'd really like to see a lot more of that. Okay, panel. That was my little transition there. So what can Alaska, or specifically the Mat-Su, how can the current research guide decisions within your organization or agency? You're providing a lot of our science, so
Not an agency. I mean,
you're an organization.
oh, I see. Okay, fine. All right, I was making notes as you guys were talking about the things you're doing. So I was curious about, I mean, maybe I could just, if I'm not answering
Just talk.
exactly
Yeah,
what
you
you
can
said.
just
let me All right, so you're talking about green infrastructure along with development, which I think is absolutely the way to go. So much harder to build these things later, after the damage, and also after there's no more room to put them somewhere. Are there currently any requirements for green infrastructure along with development? Like in Washington State, there's a requirement now for new development to deal with any stormwater on the property, with green infrastructure. So just, can you speak to that?
So I felt that was directed towards me. Yeah. So right now, the state of borough regulations is you can essentially do most building without any sort of permitting whatsoever. So we really don't learn about what is going on in landscape until our assessors find it. Certainly with road projects, with subdivisions, there are requirements that that the stormwater be managed, and so development of new roads associated with subdivision will be overseen by an engineer on the private side, as well as overseen by a borough engineer. So we do try to ensure that stormwater is managed, but a lot of times that means just getting it ditch and out to the waterway. So that's kind of where we're at right now. I things may change in the future, but that's kind of where we're at right now.
Sure. Excuse me. And from the state, we do have stormwater protection requirements during the actual construction phase of projects. But we don't have green infrastructure requirements for building, for facilities, roadways, things like that. A lot of times that's left to the local municipality. And we have such a diversity of size of cities in Alaska, that's kind of one of the reasons we've sort of left it to the municipalities to think about planning and construction in the future. But yeah, for now, it's just stormwater requirements during actual construction.
Could you repeat your question?
I like the panel asking the panel questions.
Because I want to make sure.
Okay, all right,
Thank you.
all right, you're doing good. Okay, so what can the Mat-Su, how can current research guide decisions within your organization or agency?
And then you.
And then she
Steered
added
us
on.
towards green infrastructure. Okay. So I would just want to point out, I'll speak to green infrastructure a little bit. So the borough had previously received EPA grants to promote green infrastructure. That was great. Also developed stormwater management plan. Also update the subdivision design manual plan, which encouraged green infrastructure, or allowed for green infrastructure. The borough does not have a green infrastructure design manual. Fairbanks does, that's associated with their MS4 permit. Anchorage does as well. That's associated with their MS4 permit. So both of those communities actively promote the use of green infrastructure and provide, fairly superficial designs for those who are developing subdivisions, but also like green infrastructure basic, or rain garden basic design, or residential property owners or folks that are interested in that. So, and they have staff that are able to provide some technical support to folks that are interested in pursuing that route. So that's something that a direction the borough could go as well. But now we'll circle back to your question again.
No, that was good, Matt. You guys ready for the next one? We can move on. Okay. All right. Now this is one that, go ahead, Alex.
I'd like to just,
Yep.
so, I mean, to the question of, how can we essentially bridge the gap from the research that like Dr. Tomco is doing to policy? That's kind of a big question there. And I think it's important that the research be done and then delivered in a manner that can be digested by politicians. I think if you were to show that presentation that Dr. Tomco gave, it was great. I really liked it. But I think taking that information and sort of demonstrating how this is affecting fish populations, whether it is, how mobile it is in groundwater, for instance, how persistent, and being able to take that into easily digestible information that policy can be based on is an important step in the process to affecting change.
Good point. I think there's that issue of there's tons of research to do. There's always questions, like a research project leads to more questions. And at what point can you start putting that towards policy? There's always going to be more questions. So finding that balance. Go ahead.
I would just be asking myself as a local person, like, what are we doing that's going to prevent what happened down there? Starting now, looking ahead instead of waiting for it to just happen by default.
Yeah, a good question. And that's something we'll be talking about a little bit later today on the setbacks. So as Alex indicated, right now there's a lot of development that can occur near water bodies. It doesn't require a land use permit. One of the proposals from the Water Body Setback Advisory Board is to add additional requirements for land use permitting for activities that disturb the ground within 75 feet of a water body, so that the borough is aware of the activities that are going on, and also to essentially cap impervious surfaces within 75 feet, cap clearing of vegetation within 75 feet, or within 25 feet actually, and so that for future development, the objective is to have a minimal amount of impervious surfaces within 75 feet and have as much as possible 50% of the waterfront be natural vegetation. So those are huge changes compared to where we are currently. We'll see whether or not the public is supportive of those and whether or not members of the assembly want to move forward. So as a pitch, pay attention to what my presentation is later today.
Can I just say something real quick? So as an academic, I operate on grant cycles and funding that come from sponsors. And so, I always say that, researchers are really good at hitting a target, but you got to tell them where that target is, and they can always pin it. So when it comes at the sponsor level, if they can identify, what exact research, findings are desired from the sponsor, then it helps the researchers construct their experiments so they can be scalable for policy decisions.
All right. Okay, so we've heard a lot about this 6PPD. We know that we have roads here, we have tires, we need to drive places, we have salmon streams. So I feel a little trapped. I feel like I'm contributing to this problem, and what can I do? So that's the question. What can everyday citizens do to protect water quality from 6PPD pollution, if anything?
I think it's a non-point source pollution, and I think it's just an artifact of urban environments and construction. And so I think at the individual level, I don't know if I can't think of anything.
And so, yeah, I would agree. It's a non-point source issue. And so as a local citizen, what you can really do is voice your opinion to your local community council, to your local organizations, to the state. You can voice your support for different issues. And so as an actual citizen, I think that's the strongest thing, right? Is your voice, using your voice to advocate for any change you want.
I'll add a couple practical things too. I mean, there's of course the drive less, public transit, those sorts of things. But also underappreciated, I think, is the proper inflation in your tires. Really does make a difference for how quickly they wear. And not only is that a practical thing to do, to make sure that you don't have to buy new tires too recently or, too soon. It literally means less wearing of those tires. We still need to get a picture of how much it's the wearing of the tires, the particles that are being shed, then releasing these chemicals because they have so much surface area around the particle, versus just tires on the road when it's wet, when the chemical can come directly out of those tires into runoff as in real time.
And I'm just going to, I guess, reiterate what Terry said is, you know, we have policymakers that are making decisions in a public forum. And when there's an empty room, there's just, it doesn't have the same feel as if there's a full room of people who are voicing their opinion. And, you know, holding politicians accountable by submitting written comments and actually showing up and testifying at assembly meetings where, or whatever policy board it may be, to at least let them know that people are paying attention, that they care, because there's just no accountability if there's an empty room. They'll just do whatever. So.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on that as well. I agree with what Alex is saying, and I'd like to maybe flip it a little bit. I think so source reduction is obviously an issue that is something that EPA is actually looking into. Are there alternative, and Jenifer talked about this as well, looking at alternative anti-ozonants that are less toxic. So that's research that's ongoing. But in the meantime, you know, as individuals, we may not, you know, we're not going to pull the tires off our cars necessarily. If you live here in the Matsu Borough, you have limited opportunities for mass transit, right? Some people take their fat tire bikes in weather like this, but depends how far you're going. If you're coming from Willow, it's probably not realistic. So maybe in terms of that side of the coin, as individuals, we can't have that much of an influence. But the bigger question is, how do we manage stormwater? And to Alex's point, are we making sure that our assembly members, are we making sure that our community councils, are we making sure that our peer groups are aware that this is an issue that has relevance for you and for them? If you know, they're the folks that you go fishing with, right? Or the folks that you hang out with, or the folks that come to your barbecue when you're cooking salmon. So the more awareness that there is in the community, and the more elevated the issue is in a public venue, the more likely we're going to have stormwater management standards that are protective of surface water, right? Until we have alternative chemicals that will allow us to not kill the fish when we're driving our cars.
And I want to offer, to the extent that any of the materials that I shared from, you know, the sad story happening down in the lower 48 with coho salmon and tire related pollution, if any of that material would be helpful, if anybody's going to be going and speaking to your local representatives and folks like that, you know, I'm happy to make that available as like, don't let this happen to your salmon. If you want to give some talk like that, just I'm gonna make these materials available, and you can pick whatever might be useful from it if you would like.
Great, thank you. All right, so from your perspective, and I know you're all speaking for an agency or organization or university, so from your perspective, what is the most critical next step in addressing 6PPD?
So, I mean, from our perspective, we have this really big thing right now. We are modifying a 50-year-old ordinance that deals with water body setbacks. And that is the very obvious answer for our organization. That, you know, I'd be happy to go over the details of that with anybody, but you know, it really does. Right now in the borough, if you have a lakefront lot, you can pave the entire thing and not get any permits from the borough. And this would require some accountability for that. Right now, it's actually sort of counterproductive where commercial buildings are building 75 feet away so they can build their parking lot right next to the water body that then drains right into the water body. So it's definitely, it's time that we do review this ordinance, and we have a draft out there. So that's our big one.
I think for DEC, the most critical next step is going to be any nationally recommended water quality criteria that comes out of EPA. Screening values have been released by EPA, but not national recommended numbers just yet. So we're really following that. And we're really hoping that as those values are developed, they are taking in consideration Alaskan data or Arctic conditions. Being the only Arctic state in the country, we frequently struggle with water quality standards that are really developed on data from the lower 48 and not really data from Alaska. So we're super excited that some work is happening here. And we're hoping that more Alaskan and Arctic data is taken into consideration. So really, that's the critical next step for DEC.
So as I mentioned, EPA's got lots of irons in the fire on this issue. One of the things that potentially could be characterized as critical, there's a pending petition from some tribes in Washington that are asking EPA to directly regulate 6-PPD as a toxic chemical, and there are statutory time frames for responding to those petitions. So that's something that EPA will be doing. It's not a world that I work in, so I don't want to speculate too much, but I guess I'd be surprised if EPA prohibited, for example, the use of 6-PPD in the absence of alternatives, right? But there's certainly different potential results, different actions EPA could take in response to that petition that would not be an outright prohibition, but would be restrictions, perhaps on formalization. But so that's just one thing for people to be aware of that's out there.
Okay. For my part, I think you've already heard me say these things, but the two things that came immediately to mind are finding a safer alternative that can be a replacement for 6-PPD in tires, even though it's going to be, probably decades, even if we find an alternative tomorrow, and even start putting it in tires before we make our way through stockpiles of existing tires, for example, right? But that's really critical that we're not too hasty to the point where we have a regrettable substitute that's not called 6-PPD. Maybe it's called 7-PPD, but it's, either, the same, possibly worse, or just kills chum instead of coho, or, something like that. So we're trying to do the due diligence to make sure that this is legitimately going to be safer as an alternative. And the other thing for me personally down in the world that I work in is getting more green infrastructure in place on the landscape, because as much as we're like, ooh, green infrastructure and it's a requirement in Washington State with new development and stuff, there's still kind of pitifully little of it in place.
I was just going to comment on local levels. I think we need to get a better handle on called the pollutograph, just how much of this is actually being liberated. You see this down in the lower 48, but we have very scarce amount of information. I think I gave you like 6 data points on how much 6-PPD-Q in 2 hotspot sites. So we need to have a better estimate of what mass is actually going into the streams, and then also what reservoirs of 6-PPD-Q exist that could potentially liberate it into the streams.
Good point. Send a pollutograph. I like that. It's a new thing for me. All right. So last question for the panel here. What funding sources are available for organizations or agencies wanting to work on 6-PPD? Is there research funding, monitoring funding, mitigation funding? Let's talk a little bit about the money.
So I'll start. We have 2 main funding sources available, really that goes towards green infrastructure development. One of the funding sources comes directly from EPA. It's a pass-through grant for non-point source pollution. And we just actually had a solicitation. We call it the Alaska Clean Water Actions Grant. One of the streams of actions, or one of the action types in that grant, is green infrastructure installation, planning, and design, where we target those. Unfortunately, it's not a large source of money. So usually they're small projects, but small projects add up. So we definitely encourage that work. And we, are happy to see applications when they come in. The other source of funding we have is a much larger source. It's called the State Revolving Fund. And the State Revolving Fund is also a source of money that comes from EPA. And it goes towards communities that are upgrading their wastewater treatment systems. We've had a really hard time kind of selling this additional component of the state revolving fund, in that if communities, when they're applying for a grant to upgrade their wastewater system, and they add in green infrastructure, they add in stormwater retention, treatment management, they may qualify for reduced interest rate or principal payoff for a portion of it. So while it's a loan, it ends up being cheaper in the long run because you get a reduced interest rate, or there is a principal payoff bonus or benefit as adding in green infrastructure. It's kind of a hard sell for the communities, because instead of asking for $1 million, they have to ask for $1.5 million. Even though long-term down the road, it's cheaper, but that's a hard sell for the communities and for the individual community members who have to vote on it. But it is a source of funding, and it is a larger source of funding that's available for much bigger projects. The only groups that are qualified to receive those loans are cities, municipalities, organizations, villages that are directly responsible for their wastewater treatment. So unfortunately, this is not something that non-point source can apply for. I'm sorry, NGOs can apply for, or universities. It must be the organization that is responsible for their wastewater. So that's two sources of funding. Like I said, the larger one, we've just had a really hard time selling and getting much traction on, because it's a harder sell for community members in whatever borough that might be interested in it.
Yes, I'll just follow up on that. So as Terry mentioned, so EPA has a Clean Water State Revolving Fund where we pass funding through to the state. That revolving fund program just recently received an additional $1 billion nationally to address emerging contaminants, of which 6-PPD-quinone is an emerging contaminant. There's also a component of the Clean Water Revolving Fund that's an Indian set-aside. So there's some of that funding that is earmarked for tribes. But again, it's not necessarily a green infrastructure fund, but there is funding for that. EPA has funding that's not applicable to Alaska, that's specific to Puget Sound, that's associated with the Puget Sound Geographic Program. But we do have small business innovation grant funding that we are providing to businesses and researchers that are looking at alternatives and other pieces of the puzzle.
So the Mat-Su Borough does not at this point have any grant funding for rain gardens or anything like that. I will say that the Water Body Setback Advisory Board did recommend that the Mat-Su Borough explore a tax incentive for improvements along water bodies. Apparently the Kenai Peninsula Borough is doing this, where if you invest a certain amount of money into essentially preventing stormwater from reaching the water body that you live on, you can invest that money and then recoup that over time in tax breaks. That would be pretty neat little effort there. So that would probably be after, if and when they take on this water body setback regulations, that could be something that we might be exploring.
All right. Thank you, panel. So now, audience, it's your turn. We've had some really great questions already from the different keynotes. So let's get a mic. Here's an extra microphone. Okay. So right there in the back, or just whoever, Jessica. Yeah.
Test? Here?
No.
Testing.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. As I listened to the presentations, what I saw was high traffic is likely going to be the biggest source. And so I'm curious to learn about kind of the triage approach that DEC and DOT are working on within the Muni, and looking at potentially GIS applications of, I would assume it's like
lane miles times ADT divided by catchment area, that could be a real fast way to start like targeting areas where green infrastructure improvements would be most impactful. Can you speak more about that effort for triage?
Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to speak into the detail that you're asking about, but I can definitely contact or put you in contact with the person that could. So this is just a proposal that we've submitted at this point. We have not received funding to do that yet. But yeah, essentially we are looking to kind of create heat maps of where we think might be the most likely areas, or maybe the areas with the highest potential for impacts of 6PPD. So looking at, road density, nearby water bodies, things along that. But I can put you in contact with the right person that's working on that. So it is our water quality standards, habitat group, and DOT. But I'll get that for you.
Howard, up here.
Yeah, I don't know that I need a microphone necessarily. In listening to the various presentations, the thought occurred to me, and this is probably going more to our two researchers, but anybody feel free. You're talking about trying to find alternate chemicals that will serve the function, which is one approach. You're talking about some different levels of bioremediation to trap the point source. Has anybody started looking at, I guess I'll use the term alternate chemical treatments that might either capture and neutralize this chemical in light of the fact that there isn't as much green structure anywhere as what probably is needed? And decades before we get beyond, even if they come up with a new chemical for the tire, is anybody looking at an alternate method of kind of like the roads are icy, so they finally figured out rather than dumping a bunch of salt, they'll spread gravel because it's a little less impactful on the environment. Has anybody come up with or is anybody looking at the idea of creating or developing a chemical that isn't any more dangerous, preferably is a whole lot less dangerous, but it also neutralizes this chemical?
Yeah, I'll say what I know and then you say what you know. Okay, that's how panels work, right? So yeah, I'm in touch with a researcher who I'm primarily interested in using their technology for a wastewater treatment effluent project that I have. But he initially was super interested in talking with us about his product because he's been testing it specifically for 6PPD-quinone and other tire-related chemicals now that this is out there in the world. And yeah, so this is a catalyst. It's like a synthetic enzyme that then is activated by peroxide to oxidize chemicals very, very quickly and efficiently. Which something like ozone can also do if you wastewater treatment setting, one of the tertiary treatment approaches is to use ozone to basically just blast it with so much oxygen, all the chemicals with so much oxygen that they just break down into ideally nothing at all, elemental particles. So they're interested in applying the same technology to the stormwater pollution issue, which would have to be done in like vault settings, so places where maybe, you don't have a rain garden or, something delightful like that. But instead you have some sort of a concrete vault that just, stores a bunch of stormwater so that it can be released more slowly into receiving waters. And you could treat that box of water in this way. So that's one approach that we are talking about folks with. We've got other stuff.
Yeah, I was always interested in this, the first slide I showed you on aquarium sorption and how, it was just ironic that we couldn't actually get the chemical into the water. It just kept sticking to the walls of the containers. And so I was thinking about sorption processes. So maybe not a neutralization, but you could potentially immobilize it by sticking it to some other substrate. Other projects I'm involved with involve the use of biochar for herbicide remediation in soils. So essentially you could, if you have, and we do this in Palmer, if you have soils that are contaminated with herbicides and they last for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. You can't rotate potatoes onto the field because there's so much herbicide residue and it's so cold and it's so dark out here. We've got a couple of biochar formulations that can actually be amended and, sorb the contaminant. And so, I've just thought, are there locally sourced, biochar substrates that you could add to these, sites that are of concern?
I think EPA has been doing some research on using biochar to sorb out this 6-PPD also in stormwater runoff.
Yeah, I mean, amended soils are good for immobilizing a lot of different pollutants. But I'll just discourage a lot of enthusiasm around the treatment option. That works well if you've got a community that has combined storm sewers, because you're treating your stormwater volume. But combined sewers are not it's not something we want to install. Also, vault systems are, if you've got super high density and imperviousness, there might be applications in, some parts of Anchorage, but that type of density, that type of impervious, high levels of impervious surfaces is not something I think that's a development target for anywhere in the Mat-Su. So those are to a point where we're actually able to treat the stormwater. Those are kind of development endpoints that I would discourage us from pursuing in the Mat-Su, right? And in part because not only is the stormwater, the toxicity or the contaminants of an issue, but you're totally altering the hydrograph of your local streams, of your watershed, and there's no coming back from that. I mean, if you're locking stormwater away in a vault, or you're sending it to a treatment facility where it's then discharged to a totally different receiving water, those types of large scale changes to your hydrographs are just really, really hard to reverse and super expensive if you're even going to try it.
All right, and I think we have a question in the back there.
So yeah, we're kind of thinking about this as road density, and it kind of seems like maybe an Anchorage, Fairbanks, bigger place problem, right? But what about some of the other sources? So a lot of the docks on a lot of our lakes have tires strapped to them. Tugboats pushing around stuff have rubber strapped to them. Our playgrounds are ground up rubber in several places. One, have you tested some of these other sources? Have you tested near a tire that's just sitting in the water? And two, what is the fate of this in salt water?
Did that cover it for you? I don't have an answer right now, but I do have a project that we're just starting where we are taking out some tires from built reefs in marine waters, and looking to see, do they still contain 6-PPD? Probably not 6-PPD-quinone. Could they still be a source of concern in those applications? And also river embankments where they may not be underwater the whole time, right? They may be underwater and out of the water and a little bit more of a dynamic risk than the ones that are just underwater all of the time. So those are areas we're going to be learning stuff about in the next couple of years here.
I mean, you're asking great questions. I just want to express how new this whole topic is. We're talking a couple of years, just of having an analytical standard available of this chemical that you could purchase, to now it's a worldwide issue. So great questions, but we're just not there yet.
I'm sorry, we're out of time, but our panelists are going to be around, I think, for the rest of the day. So feel free, please, to continue this really amazing discussion. I know I've learned tons. There's a lot of research that's been going on. There's still a lot of research to do. There's some policy decisions that are going to have to be made. And there's a lot of on the ground work to do too. So thank you to all of our panelists. Nice job. So everyone, please stick around for the afternoon. We have some really good sessions still to come. We're going to break for lunch in just a minute here, and it's going to be set up in the back hallway. If you were here yesterday, similar to that. But before we break for lunch, and panelists, you're welcome to